The woman known historically as Isabella of France, or Queen Isabella of England, was born sometime in the mid-1290s in Paris, France, most likely in 1295, or possibly 1296. The exact date is not clear, which is a not uncommon situation concerning medieval births, for which records can often be incomplete. Her father was King Philip IV of France, sometimes called Philip the Fair, due to his reportedly good looks. He had come to the French throne in 1284. Philip also held the title of King of Navarre through his marriage to Isabella's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, a small kingdom situated primarily on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees in what is now the Basque country in northeastern Spain. She and Philip had married in 1284. Isabella was their sixth child. Two daughters had been born before her, Margaret at some point in the late 1280s and Blanche in 1290. Blanche died when she was 3 years old in 1294, before Isabella entered the world, and Margaret would also die in childhood in 1300, making Isabella her father's only daughter within a few years of her birth, and consequently a valuable asset in the political dealings of Western Europe. Isabella also had 4 brothers: Louis, born in 1289, Philip, born around 1291, Charles, born in 1294, and Robert, born in 1296 or 1297, thus Isabella's only younger sibling. Robert would also die in childhood, but Louis, Philip, and Charles would each live to become kings of France and Navarre, one after another. The political circumstances of both France and England at the time of her birth in the late 13th century are crucial for understanding the course of Isabella's entire life. Unlike in the early modern and modern eras, France was not a unified kingdom during either the High Middle Ages or the later medieval period. It was deeply fragmented, with powers like the Dukes of Burgundy controlling extensive territories in the eastern part of the country and others such as the Counts of Flanders dominating the region around much of Belgium and northeastern France. The papacy in Rome even governed a small fiefdom in southern France centered on the city of Avignon. The kings of France nominally claimed authority over the whole country, yet their power was subject to fluctuations over the decades, with various nobles and lords exercising considerable independence during periods when there were weak rulers in Paris. Unlike many of her predecessors as Queen of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, a substantial number of sources concerning Isabella's life are still in existence today. Many of these were chronicles written in the medieval tradition by figures such as Thomas Walsingham, a late 14th century Benedictine monk who composed a comprehensive history of the rulers of England from the early 14th century up to his own time. Another was Walter of Guisborough, whose Chronicon Angliae, or English Chronicle, documented the reigns of Isabella's husband Edward II and her son Edward III, providing many details on Isabella herself and her role in both. A French chronicler, Guillaume de Nangy, wrote extensively on events at the close of the 13th century in a manner that relates to Isabella's very earliest years and the circumstances that led to her marriage with Edward II. Similarly, the Wigmore Chronicles, a set of annals detailing major events in English history between the middle of the 11th century and the beginning of the 14th, also shed light on the political conditions in England upon Isabella's arrival there, while a growing volume of bureaucratic records was being generated in 14th century England, given its status as the most centralized state in Western Europe at that time. However, these sources have their limitations. Medieval chroniclers did not write with the goal of maintaining an objective perspective, as modern historians aim for. Instead, they often wrote to persuade their readers of their own political viewpoints, and thus many depicted Isabella negatively for her actions in defying the conventional norms of matrimony at the time. As will become clear, though, her actions were often those of a woman who had learned from a young age to survive through her resourcefulness. In a somewhat unusual development, which points to the evolution of European society on the cusp of the Renaissance, Isabella was afforded an elite education, something not customary for women in the 13th century for the most part, and which had only become common for royal princes in the 12th century. Many rulers as recently as the 11th century had been illiterate and largely left the business of government to church figures and scribes, regarding warfare as their true domain. Around the Louvre Palace in the Palais de la Cité in Paris, she was surrounded by some of the foremost scholars of the age at the University of Paris, and at her father's court, she had access to tutors from a young age and a vast library. As a result, she grew up to be one of the most educated royal women of the High Middle Ages. From the moment she was born, her father was undoubtedly considering who she would be married to. Incredibly, Philip had betrothed one of his daughters, Blanche, to the Infante or Prince of Castile, the future King Ferdinand IV, when she was just an infant, the better to ally France with the powerful Spanish kingdom. When she died, he then betrothed his daughter Margaret to Ferdinand, but when Margaret also passed away in 1300, he declined to arrange for his final daughter to potentially marry the Castilian prince. The reason was that Isabella, who was perhaps as young as 3 or 4 years old at the time, had been promised to Prince Edward of England, the son and heir of King Edward I in 1299. In 1294, Isabella's father had gone to war with England in an effort to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward I, while he was otherwise preoccupied with a war in Scotland. This unhappy conflict dragged on for several years without conclusive results for either side, and by 1297, both parties had decided that continuing the conflict was not worth the cost in men and money. Peace negotiations were initiated and were finally concluded in 1299 when the 60-year-old Edward I, a widower for nearly a decade, married Philip's 17-year-old sister Marguerite, while Isabella was betrothed to Prince Edward, who was at least closer to her in age, having turned 15 in the spring of 1299. The match remained merely a betrothal at this early stage, Isabella being considered too young for a marriage ceremony to actually take place, even by medieval standards. Instead, the wedding would not occur for nearly a full decade longer. It was finally solemnized at the Church of Our Lady in the town of Boulogne on the northern coast of France, overlooking the English Channel on the 25th of January, 1308. By then, Edward was 23 years old, while Isabella was nearing her teenage years, an age considered old enough for marriage in the 14th century. By then, Isabella was marrying a king rather than a prince. Edward I had died 6 months earlier, and her new husband had succeeded him as King Edward II. It would prove a problematic union from the very beginning, as Edward was bisexual and tended to prefer the company of men, though he was not averse to women and fathered an illegitimate son a few years before his marriage to Isabella. His preference for male company also extended to favoring certain male individuals at court and allowing them and their families and factions to rise to positions of great power and wealth, something which would fracture the political community in England during his 20-year reign, shaping Isabella's life in many ways in the process. A prevalent myth concerning Isabella is her relationship with the Scottish rebel William Wallace. At the time Isabella was first betrothed to Prince Edward, his father, King Edward I, had been involved in a long-running war with the Scots led by a number of prominent nobles and knights, including William Wallace. This was all part of England's constant attempts throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period to impose control over all of Britain, including Scotland. Edward had famously largely conquered Scotland in the mid-1290s, dragging the Stone of Scone, the inauguration stone used by Scottish kings, back to England in 1296 as a symbol of the destruction of Scottish independence. It was a temporary situation, however, and the Scots were soon at war with England again. William Wallace was captured as part of this new rebellion in Glasgow in 1305 and was executed in August of that year at Smithfield in London. Isabella was around 10 years old at this time and was still residing in France. Almost immediately upon Isabella's arrival in England, despite her young age, she would have been aware of a growing unease at court and more widely about the influence of one Piers Gaveston over her husband. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight. The relationship quickly became problematic as Gaveston's influence over the younger Edward grew, and rumors circulated around the court. Edward I exiled Piers from the court as a result in the mid-1300s, and then, after a brief reconciliation in 1306, ordered him to leave England entirely in 1307. Yet the old king's death just a few months later saw Gaveston recalled, and the new king now promoted him to the title of Earl of Cornwall, while also granting him and his friends and family members extensive lands and offices. All of this was generating immense discontent among the nobility of England, many of whom observed that the earldom of Cornwall had typically been reserved for a member of the royal family. This opposition included a faction led by the Earls of Warenne, Hereford, Pembroke, and Lincoln, who just weeks after Isabella arrived in England, urged Parliament to demand that Edward exile Gaveston yet again. The king yielded in large part because Isabella's father sent word from France that he was displeased with news of this court favorite upon whom Edward bestowed such favors when his energies should have been focused on making his new wife feel at home in a foreign land. King Philip was undoubtedly especially dismayed to learn that when Edward and Isabella's joint coronation took place at Westminster Abbey near London, a month to the day after their marriage in northern France, Gaveston was central to the ceremony, being elaborately dressed and leading the king and queen through the main aisle of the abbey during the procession. Something clearly had to change, and Gaveston was exiled once more, being sent on this occasion to serve as the king's lieutenant in the lordship of Ireland. Ireland was only a short boat ride away from Wales, and it was perhaps inevitable that Edward, who had been miserable after Gaveston left, conspired for Piers to return secretly in the summer of 1309. A fresh political storm followed in the subsequent months as it became known that Gaveston was back in England. For her part, Isabella was by then of an age to fully appreciate some of the political nuances of what was happening, and also the difficult marital situation that her husband's relationship with the upstart was creating. This included the uncomfortable scenario in which Edward, Isabella, and Piers ended up heading north to oversee a military campaign against the Scots, who were making incursions into northern England under their new leader, Robert Bruce, the aspirant to the throne of Scotland. Edward's decision to grant Gaveston command over much of the ensuing campaign was sufficient cause for the nobles to once again call for his exile in 1311. A final departure and return to England exceeded the limits of their patience. When he reappeared in England in 1312, a group of nobles led by the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick, and Pembroke orchestrated his detention and killing that summer. Isabella must have breathed a sigh of relief, but there would soon be a new royal favorite and new problems, while the tensions between Edward and his nobles would continue virtually unabated for the next 15 years. Eventually, as she grew older and learned to look after her own interests, Isabella would transition from being a bystander in these political intrigues to a major participant herself. Isabella's relief at Gaveston's death in the summer of 1312 was compounded by the birth of her and Edward's first child just a few months later. Edward of Windsor was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle and was named after both his father and grandfather. Young Edward, like his mother, would have to mature prematurely in his early teenage years as political events unfolded around him. All of that was yet to come, though. In the interim, Isabella and Edward II had 3 further children, while suffering at least 1 miscarriage. Another boy, John, was born in 1316, solidifying the line of succession with 2 male heirs. 2 daughters then followed, Eleanor of Woodstock in the summer of 1318 and Joan in the summer of 1321. Often referred to as Joan of the Tower, as her mother gave birth to her in the Tower of London, the city's great medieval and early modern fortress. Isabella was seemingly central to one of the more scandalous episodes at the French court in the early 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a guard tower on the old city walls of Paris. Each of her brothers had married into the nobility of Burgundy in eastern France, which, as we have seen, was a powerful rival to the French crown for dominance over large parts of the country and would remain so for another century and a half. Her brother Louis, for instance, married Margaret of Burgundy, the second daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. Philip married Joan, the daughter of Count Otto IV of Burgundy. Finally, Joan's sister, Blanche of Burgundy, married Isabella's other brother Charles. King Philip responded by having some of his spies monitor the 2 knights and his 2 daughters-in-law. The investigations led to the conclusion that Blanche and Margaret had been engaged in infidelities, meeting the 2 knights at the Tour de Nesle tower along the city walls. In the ensuing fallout, it was also concluded that while Philip's wife, Joan, had not been unfaithful to her husband, she had known of the affair her sister Blanche was involved in and was complicit to some extent as a result. In the period that followed, both Blanche and Margaret were arrested and imprisoned, while Sir Gautier and Sir Philip were executed for their role in what was a serious social and political embarrassment for the French royal family. Blanche and Margaret were put on trial and subjected to public humiliation by having their heads shaved. They were then sent to the Chateau Gaillard. Margaret died within a year, perhaps on the orders of her husband, who had become king after Isabella's father's death in November 1314, while Blanche remained imprisoned until her marriage was finally annulled in 1322, freeing her husband to marry again. Joan was eventually pardoned by her husband for her alleged role in covering up her sister and sister-in-law's actions. The royal visit to France in the summer of 1313 was important in other respects. It was an episode that saw Isabella emerge for the first time as a significant intermediary between England and France and her entry into the world of high politics as she reached what we would now consider young womanhood. The occasion was the triple knighting of her three brothers, who would then knight hundreds of other Frenchmen in a grand royal event that symbolized the arrival of a new generation of French nobles and leaders. Days of celebrations took place during which Edward and Isabella were often central. There was a formal ceremony as well, in which many individuals, including Isabella, took the cross, the symbol of the Crusaders that had been worn since 1095 when the First Crusade began. Although by 1313 the Crusader states in the Holy Land had all been conquered by the Islamic powers there. We gain insight into the minor failings of royalty here, as one chronicler noted with some amusement that Edward and Isabella overslept for the ceremony of taking the cross. More seriously, negotiations followed in the subsequent days during which King Philip, Isabella's father, assured Edward that he would receive support from France if he required it against his rebellious nobles back in England. Isabella had seemingly played a key role in the diplomacy involved. Back in England, Isabella soon learned that Gaveston's murder had not put an end to the domestic unrest in her husband's realm. In the months prior to Gaveston's fall, the faction opposed to him had come under the control of Thomas, 2nd Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of Edward's whose grandfather was King Henry III and whose father, Edmund Crouchback, had been King Edward I's brother. Thomas also traced his ancestry on his mother's side back to the royal families of France and Navarre. This made Lancaster the most powerful noble in England, and he had been instrumental in Gaveston's downfall. After the favorite was murdered, an uneasy reconciliation followed between him and the king, one in which it was made clear that Edward was a monarch whose authority had been seriously undermined. The ensuing years were consequently characterized by continued political turmoil, exacerbated when the Scots won a major victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, gaining the upper hand in the Scottish War of Independence in the process. As Edward was on the verge of losing Scotland, which his father had largely completed the conquest of 20 years earlier, his standing in the eyes of his nobles plummeted even further. The years that followed were marked by a growing drift towards outright conflict once again between Edward and his nobles. The instability was worsened by a major famine between 1315 and 1317 caused by bad weather and the widespread outbreak of a bovine disease that decimated cattle stocks across England. The Crown did nothing to improve public opinion during this time by continuing its extravagant spending, including Isabella, who had developed a habit of wasting large sums of money on outward pomp and ceremony. The Dispenser War, as it is often termed, lasted for 10 months between May 1321 and March 1322. In its early stages, the alliance of anti-Dispenser nobles held the advantage and converged on London. It was this military action that forced Isabella to seek refuge in the Tower of London and thus gave birth to her daughter Joan there. It was just weeks later that Isabella intervened with Edward, apparently kneeling before her husband and imploring him to expel Dispenser from England to restore peace to the country. Incredibly, Edward agreed to her request and commanded Hugh and his father to leave the country. However, Isabella was also instrumental within weeks in the renewed outbreak of hostilities when, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, she was refused entry and hospitality at Leeds Castle in Kent, a residence of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a lord who had sided with Lancaster and the others against Edward just months earlier. The king took this rebuff of his wife as the justification he needed to recommence the war, and within weeks the Dispensers were back in England with fresh reinforcements. By the spring it was all over, with Edward and the Dispensers having won victory over Lancaster, Hereford, Mortimer, and their allies at the Battle of Boroughbridge on the 16th of March, 1322. Whether Isabella was an unaware pawn in Edward's schemes, and he simply used the event at Leeds Castle as an excuse to resume hostilities, or whether her entire pilgrimage to Canterbury was a clever ploy in which Isabella was complicit remains a mystery to this day. Victory in the Dispenser War saw Edward exact revenge for a decade of perceived wrongs committed by his nobles. Hereford was killed in the fighting at Boroughbridge, apparently dying in a particularly gruesome manner as a pike was run through his anus and into his intestines, his screams reportedly dismaying his soldiers and contributing to the defeat. Lancaster was placed on trial, where a panel led by the Dispensers refused to let him speak in his own defense and found him guilty. He was executed 6 days after Boroughbridge, while Mortimer was detained and sentenced to death. However, his sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower of London, a significant development for Isabella's future affairs. He escaped from the Tower in August 1323 and, after a brief attempt to raise a fresh revolt against the crown, fled to France. In the interim, the Despensers and their faction now had free rein to rule England as they wished. For his part, Edward began inflicting punishment on anyone he perceived to have been responsible for Gaveston's murder back in 1312, and the undermining of his royal authority ever since. Dozens of lords and members of their families were imprisoned. Others were even less fortunate. Bartholomew de Badlesmere, the owner of Leeds Castle, where Isabella is being refused hospitality in late autumn 1321, had reignited the Despenser War, was dragged by a horse through the streets of Canterbury before being hanged and decapitated outside the town, his head placed on a pike overlooking anyone who entered or left the Kentish religious center as a symbol of Edward's newfound power and tyranny. If Edward believed in the mid-1320s, in the aftermath of the Despenser War, that he was finally free from opposition and could rule much as he pleased, he would soon discover he was mistaken. And with Lancaster, Hereford, and many of his other opponents dead, the opposition would now come from a different, unexpected source: his wife. There were multiple reasons for her growing estrangement. In late 1322, she was put in danger while in northern England when her husband failed to respond quickly enough to a Scottish incursion into the north of the country. More worryingly, in January 1322, Isabella's brother Charles had ascended to the throne of France as King Charles IV. Over the next year or so, relations between England and France deteriorated over a number of issues, chief among which was Edward's position as Duke of Aquitaine in western France. As this occurred, the Despensers began targeting Isabella herself and her large number of French staff, many of whom had lived with her in England since her arrival in 1308. In total, 27 of her household staff were removed and arrested on the grounds of being French, as well as her chaplain and personal physician. The Queen was also stripped of most of her personal lands, and her household budget was drastically reduced. The final indignity came when the Despensers removed her three younger children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, from her custody and entrusted their upbringing to Hugh Despenser's wife and sister. All of these attacks on her would combine to lead Isabella to begin plotting her own attack on the Despensers and her husband from the mid-1320s onwards. The opportunity she had been seeking arrived when she was sent as an envoy to France in March 1325. Isabella was dispatched across the Channel with a large retinue of staff loyal to Edward and the Despensers, her instructions being to negotiate peace terms in the war that had erupted between England and France, and then to return so that Edward could finally settle the war with the Scots without fear of French intervention. She was determined to act differently. Over a period of several months of negotiation in France, she steered the discussion to focus on whether or not her husband, as Duke of Aquitaine, would come to France to pay homage to her brother, who as King of France was theoretically Edward's liege lord. Edward was unwilling to do this, but in response, Isabella proposed an alternative solution in early autumn 1325. If her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, were sent to France, Charles would accept him paying homage as the basis for peace without his father, King Edward II, having to do so. Such a convenient solution was quickly accepted, and Prince Edward, who was coincidentally in southern England at the time, was conveyed across the Channel to his mother. King Edward and the Despensers had fallen into the trap, with Prince Edward, the eldest son and heir to the Kingdom of England, now in Isabella's care within the safety of her brother's French dominions. She was in a position to initiate her own campaign against her husband and the Despensers. Isabella's actions in the autumn of 1325 were exacerbated in the following months by her developing relationship with Roger Mortimer, one of the leaders of the opposition to the crown during the Despenser War, who had subsequently been imprisoned and then escaped from the Tower of London. There is no evidence to suggest, as some historians of the 19th century attempted to claim, that Isabella assisted Mortimer in escaping from the Tower back in 1323 before he fled to France. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in France, in late 1325, she began meeting with Mortimer, who had become the de facto head of an anti-crown and anti-Despenser party of English exiles in Paris. The relationship became sexual towards the end of 1325. Isabella must have been aware of how perilous all her behavior now was. After all, two of her sisters-in-law had been put on trial and imprisoned over a decade earlier during the Tourdonel affair due to their infidelities. The affair she now commenced with Mortimer was to be one of the most dramatic in medieval European history, one that burned brightly for half a decade and had a huge impact on England's politics, while also violating deeply held contemporary beliefs concerning matrimony and patriarchy. A more vivid description might suggest they were somewhat like a medieval royal Bonnie and Clyde. By early 1326, with Prince Edward in their custody and a growing amount of financial and military backing provided by Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, Isabella and Mortimer were prepared to make their move against her former husband and the Despensers. On the 22nd of September 1326, with a small fleet of ships and men, ships primarily supplied by Count Guillaume of Hainaut, whose daughter Philippa Isabella had promised her son Prince Edward would marry in exchange for his support, she set sail for England. They landed on the coast of Suffolk in East Anglia 2 days later. In the days that followed, the unpopular and tyrannical regime of Edward and the Despensers crumbled as leading nobles and lords abandoned the crown and sided with the small invading force from France led by Isabella and Mortimer. Calls for troops to gather in defense of the government were ignored, while towns and cities such as Cambridge opened their gates to the small army from France. By early October, as Isabella and Mortimer advanced towards London, Edward fled the capital towards the West Midlands and then into Wales. On the 16th of November, the invasion culminated in its great success when Edward and Despenser were captured in southern Wales. Edward's fate would be decided later, but 8 days later, Despenser was found guilty in a summary trial, following which he was hanged from the city walls of Hereford, before being disemboweled and castrated while still alive. The ordeal of being hanged, drawn, and quartered only ending when the executioner beheaded him. Isabella and Mortimer were received in England upon their arrival from France in autumn 1326 as saviors from the quasi-tyranny of Edward II in the Despenser faction. However, many people soon realized that they had simply exchanged one form of irresponsible kleptocracy and heavy-handed rule for another. In particular, the land acquisition that Isabella and Mortimer undertook during 1327 and 1328 was remarkable. Isabella had her dower lands, which had been taken from her back in 1323, returned to her, but in addition she seized huge estates that made her wealthier than any magnate had been in England for decades, with an annual rental income from her lands across England and Wales that considerably exceeded those controlled by Thomas of Lancaster, the greatest noble in the kingdom for much of Edward II's reign. She also seized half a dozen prominent castles across England, notably Bristol Castle and Pontefract. She would proceed to deplete the exchequer of any remaining funds, some admittedly to pay off her soldiers, but others to finance her own extravagance in the years ahead. Mortimer's behavior mirrored hers. He quickly seized vast estates across southern Wales and the English West Midlands, proclaiming himself as the Earl of March in parallel to symbolize his dominant position in the March or border region between England and Wales. All of this very quickly caused public sentiment towards Isabella and Mortimer to shift. A regency council, which included many of the leading nobles who had survived the purges of the Despenser period and the overthrow of Edward II, had been established to govern the country until such time as Edward III was old enough to rule himself. It became clear within months, however, that Isabella and Mortimer considered this merely a facade to legitimize what was effectively rule by Isabella and her lover, who could not even marry each other after Edward II was killed because Mortimer was still married to Joan de Geneville, with whom he had had a dozen children over the years. What created a scenario in which their regency became untenable were events in Scotland. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer agreed to end the interminable war that had been ongoing between England and Scotland for decades by consenting to recognize an independent Scotland with Robert Bruce as its king. To solidify the alliance, Isabella proposed that her youngest daughter, Joan of the Tower, marry Bruce's son and heir, 4-year-old David, thus cementing a new reconciliation with the Scots. But while Isabella and Mortimer deemed this a satisfactory conclusion to the conflict with the Scots, young King Edward III, who was now nearing his 16th birthday, considered it a humiliation and the relinquishment of much of his birthright. From this point onwards, he was plotting to overthrow his mother and her lover and begin ruling in their place. The entire episode served as a warning to Edward III, and his household was filled with staff loyal to his mother and Mortimer. What finally brought matters to a head was the execution in March 1330 of the Earl of Kent, a younger son of King Edward I and Edward III's half-uncle. The political realm was shocked by this transgression, and Lancaster now urged Edward to act, which he did. In mid-October 1330, he and his conspirators surrounded Isabella and Mortimer with their retinue at Nottingham Castle. Both were detained, and Edward finally asserted his decision to begin ruling on his own behalf on the eve of his 18th birthday. 6 weeks later, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn in London. Isabella had pleaded for his life to be spared. Her son had refused to listen. Isabella was placed under house arrest following her and Mortimer's fall from power and her lover's execution. She was initially detained at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire for several weeks before being moved to Windsor Castle shortly before Christmas 1330, in what was clearly a relaxation of her conditions, as she was placed closer to where her son could have contact with her. During these months, discussions clearly took place regarding how she could be reconciled to the new situation and rehabilitated. The narrative that would be presented moving forward was that Isabella had been misled by the malevolent Mortimer, and had, as a result, temporarily failed to live up to her responsibilities towards her son as King of England. As these negotiations were underway, she was also mourning Mortimer, and such was her emotional state that more than one historian has concluded she suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind during these months. Eventually, she recovered, and ever a realist and pragmatist when it came to politics, she agreed to the new narrative that had been decided upon. Since her arrival in England 22 years earlier as a child to marry Edward II, she had learned to survive by her wits in the circumstances she now found herself in during the early 1330s, still some way short of her 40th year, or no different. Satisfied that she posed no further threat to her son's reign, the decision was made to set her free in 1332. While Isabella was free from 1332 onwards, there was absolutely no doubt that her political life was virtually over. The vast lands she had accumulated from late 1326 onwards were surrendered to the crown at the end of 1330. But Edward now granted her castle rising in Norfolk, East Anglia, where she would live in retirement. He was more than generous, allotting her a pension of $3,000 a year as well, a fortune by 14th century standards. Despite a past belief that Isabella was in semi-exile here, this was certainly not the case. She was regularly visited over the years by leading nobles who came to see the Queen Dowager and the King's mother, while Edward III called on occasion too, during which Castle Rising was transformed into the center of the political world in England as the royal court relocated there. Over time, she became a doting grandmother as the marriage between her son and Philippa of Hainaut, which she had negotiated back in 1326, resulted in a large brood of children, starting with the birth of a new Edward, the Black Prince, in 1330, with many more following throughout the 1330s and into the 1340s. Over time, she was also welcomed back to the royal court at Windsor or in London on occasion. In many ways, this represented the attainment of much of what she had always sought: comfort and stability, the very things her husband's tumultuous reign had deprived her of from her teenage years onwards, and which she had initiated her relationship with Mortimer in pursuit of. Isabella was able to play a minor role in political affairs during her long retirement due to events in France. Back in 1328, while she and Mortimer were effectively ruling England in her son's name, Isabella's brother Charles died, the third and last of her brothers to die in quick succession after Louis in 1316, who seems to have succumbed to pleurisy, and Philip in 1322. Although Louis had a son, he died in infancy after spending just 5 days on the throne himself in 1316, while both Philip and Charles died without a male heir. Furthermore, the Salic law in France prohibited a woman from becoming queen regnant, unlike in England. This presented the possibility of Edward III having a legitimate claim to the French throne on account of his being Isabella's son and King Philip the Fair's grandson. However, at a meeting of the French nobles shortly after Charles's death, it was determined that Philip, Count of Valois, would succeed as King Philip VI and establish a new royal line. This dispensation held firm for nearly a decade. However, in 1337, England and France ended up at war after Philip attempted to confiscate a portion of England's remaining lands in western France around Gascony and the county of Ponthieu. With this, Edward went to war with the French. And not only that, but he decided to press his claim to the throne of France, which had been passed over in 1328. It marked the beginning of what would become the 100 Years' War between England and France, as successive English monarchs sought to resurrect the Angevin Empire of the 12th century when England had ruled much of France. As the woman through whom Edward based his claim to the French throne, and as one of the only senior surviving members of the royal house of Capet, Isabella suddenly acquired new political significance from the late 1330s onwards. The diplomatic mission to Charles of Navarre was one of the last actions of Isabella's life. She appeared at Windsor Castle, which her son had significantly expanded to make it the finest royal castle in England, for the St. George's Day celebrations there on the 23rd of April 1358, and was noted for the richness of her attire, which reportedly was inlaid with hundreds of precious gemstones, such as rubies and upwards of 2,000 pearls. This ostentatious display of wealth was somewhat in contrast to her decision just a few weeks later to take the nun's habit of the Poor Clares, or Order of St. Clare, a monastic order founded centuries earlier by St. Clare of Assisi, one of St. Francis's first followers. She had been ill for several months and must have been aware when she made this decision that her life was nearing its end. Isabella died on the 22nd of August 1358, most likely at around 63 years of age. A longer than usual delay followed before her funeral was finally held on the 27th of November 1358. Although it had already become a tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster Abbey by this time, this did not necessarily extend to queen consorts, and so Isabella was interred at the Greyfriars Church in London alongside her aunt, Queen Marguerite, Edward I's second wife, and the same king's mother, Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III. There she was laid to rest with the clothes she had worn as a child on the cusp of her teenage years the day she married Edward II half a century earlier draped over her. Her daughter, Joan of the Tower, was buried there as well 4 years later. Many of those who might have viewed Isabella as a malevolent figure who had prolonged the instability wrought by Edward II's reign beyond 1326 may have looked to the future as potentially being a more favorable time for England. And it must be said that for a period in the middle of the 14th century under her son, the kingdom's fortunes did significantly improve as England had the better of the opening stages of the 100 Years' War. But they would soon have been disabused of this notion in the period following Isabella's death. England's problem, it turned out, did not lie with the former queen, but within the broader politics of the realm. Edward's grandson, King Richard II, presided over a period from his accession in the late 1370s in which renewed unrest between England's nobles and the crown erupted. It subsided and resurfaced until he was overthrown and killed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Isabella's great-grandson, in 1399. And this only led to a period of vague stability until the middle of the 15th century when a new civil war, the Wars of the Roses, broke out again. Isabella and Mortimer, it transpired, were symptoms of the political instability that constantly pitted the crown against the nobles in late medieval England, not the cause of it. Isabella of France possesses a reputation as one of the most formidable female figures in English history, being termed a she-wolf in 2 eminent early 21st century studies of her life. But if she became a she-wolf over time, she certainly did not arrive in England as one. Instead, she was a child being married off to an adult male in a foreign land for political expediency. Then as she grew up, she learned that her husband was a ruler, seemingly intent on choosing favorites at his court in ways that antagonized the majority of the political community. There was constant instability around her and war with foreign enemies. In this environment, she had to adapt and became ruthless herself in attempting to promote her own interests in a situation where she knew her husband would not. It was this situation that led to her eventually beginning her relationship with Mortimer and overthrowing her own husband. She was poorly regarded for centuries as a result, a development that simply points towards a latent misogyny in assessing the actions of a woman who was deemed to have violated the natural laws of matrimony. Many historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that she destabilized England as a result, but in reality, the conflicts of the 1320s were merely a few among many that characterized the English crown's relationship with the wider political community between the 12th and 17th centuries. Ultimately, if Isabella was ruthless, it was in response to finding herself in this politically volatile environment at such a young and vulnerable age. What is your opinion of Isabella of France? Was she a malevolent schemer who destabilized England? Or was she simply a woman who, having been cast into the maelstrom of English politics as a child, learned to survive as best she could?